All right, hello again all. Let's go ahead and get started. My name is Meg Gibbon and I'm Switchboard's Program Officer for Learning and Knowledge Management. Before we dive into today's content, I'm just going to review some logistics in this WebEx platform. And thank you once again for joining today's session on collecting client feedback data. So if you are using phone audio today, you can click the I icon in the upper left corner of your screen at any time to find the dial-in number and code. If you don't see this icon, just click anywhere on the main webinar screen and it will appear. We welcome your comments and questions throughout today's session. Please click the chat bubble icon in the bottom center of your screen to open up the chat and type in your response or your question. Do send your message to all participants so that we can all view what you've had to say. And once again, if you don't see the icon tray at the bottom of your screen, just click anywhere on the main webinar view and that will appear for you. Lastly, during Q&A, if you'd like, you can click the very small hand icon at the bottom right of your screen to raise your hand, and we can unmute your line to hear from you. And then one final thing I'd like to mention is that today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on the Switchboard website in the next day or two. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Flor de Ruyter to talk about today's speakers.
Hello, everyone. My name is Flor de Ruyter, and I am Switchboard's Program Officer for Monitoring and Evaluation. And I'm also joined today by Graham Rogers, who is IRC's Technical Advisor for Research. So in terms of the learning objectives for today's session, by the end of today's webinar, we hope that you will be able to explain why collecting client feedback is important, name some key steps you can take when choosing appropriate methods for collecting feedback, and finally, better understand individual methods such as surveys, focus groups, and interviews. Okay, so first I'd like to start by introducing the Switchboard program, since we're relatively new. So I think just to start off, we'd like to start with a quick poll to gauge how familiar you are with Switchboard. So I'll hand it over to Meg for the poll.
Great. Thank you so much, Flor. Can you just confirm that you can hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Sorry, I had a bit of a blip in my audio there. If anyone's having trouble with audio, go ahead and just send me a chat message, and I'm happy to help with that. I will get this poll open in just one moment.
So while Meg's setting that up, I can read out the poll. So how familiar are you with Switchboard? Is it A, very familiar? I feel confident describing Switchboard to a colleague. B, somewhat familiar. I've heard of Switchboard before, but don't know much about it. Or C, not familiar. I've never heard of Switchboard before.
You know, I apologize. It looks like we're having a little trouble with the poll on the technical side, but go ahead and type your answer into the chat.
Okay, so it looks like we are getting a range of answers. Some of you are very familiar. Some of you are somewhat familiar, and then some have really never heard of Switchboard before. So, Meg, if you could give me the controls, I will move it over so we can talk a little bit about the Switchboard program. So first of all, what is Switchboard? It is a one-stop resource hub for refugee service providers in the United States. And we offer tools, materials, learning opportunities, research, and technical assistance on resettlement-related topics. And we're implemented by the International Rescue Committee in partnership with Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. So I'd just like to flag our website, which is switchboardta.org. And there you'll be able to find a lot of hopefully useful resources. So we have a lot of online resources. The resource library has a variety of resettlement-related learning materials, and it hosts content both developed by Switchboard as well as former OR-funded technical assistance providers and some external content. So there's a lot that might be useful to you. And so these resources include anything from archived webinars, we have templates, tip sheets, videos, and topics really range from anything from employment, education, and health to organizational development, monitoring and evaluation, et cetera. And we also have a TA request form, and that's where you can request technical assistance from us. And we provide free personalized TA to refugee service providers in the U.S. Who currently receive funding from the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And so that includes state agencies, ethnic community-based organizations, resettlement agencies. And we can do remote technical assistance, and when feasible, we've also done in-person training. So in terms of learning opportunities, there's an online learning portal, which I just wanted to make you aware of. And so we have opportunities for you to take self-paced e-learning modules, and we're working on a longer certificate course for more intensive group learning. And then later this year, we'll also begin to facilitate communities of practice, which will be an opportunity for peer-to-peer learning across the resettlement community. And our first one will be focused on monitoring and evaluation. And then you can also sign up for our newsletter and access the blog at switchboardta.org. Okay, and just wanted to provide some concrete examples of things we've helped with so far in this fiscal year to give you just some ideas of what the technical assistance could look like. So first, we provide training on mental health screening. Another example is we could help you review your program's theory of change. We can help with career advancement strategies. And finally, we can provide resources on collecting and incorporating client feedback. This is not exhaustive. We can, we have many topics and experts we can rely on, since we also have a roster of consultants with different expertise. So now to move on to the collecting client feedback data portion. I'd like to go over now 6 questions to keep in mind when collecting client feedback. And the idea is that collecting this feedback will help us in being client responsive, which is when we design and implement in a way that takes into account the views of our clients. So this approach, we really try to place those we're serving at the center of our decisions, with the goal of delivering services that are effective, appropriate, and relevant to them. And it also contributes to building trust with the people we serve, really making us ensure their protection and help us manage risk as well. And I just wanted to say that this approach does not mean that we will do everything that every client asks. I think it's important to mention that client responsive programs consider client perspectives along with other important considerations, such as organizational values and mandates, program context, of course funding, legal and operational priorities and constraints. But nevertheless, I think we can always respond to client feedback, and if possible, refer unmet requests to different partners or other stakeholders. So these are the 6 key questions for choosing methods that I'd like to talk about. So I'll just list them first, and then we can do a deeper dive. So what do we need to learn and why? What type of information do we need to answer these questions? Who can provide this information? Which data collection methods will enable us to collect this information? What human and financial resources do we need to collect this data, and do we have them? And finally, what actions or decisions could we take as a result of this client feedback data? So we recommend really coming together as a program team to discuss these questions as you begin to plan any of these data collection processes, including data related to client opinions, attitudes, and perspectives. And these questions can be used when choosing methods for any data collection need, but today we'll focus on the particular lens of choosing methods for client feedback data. So to dive into the first question, what do we need to learn and why? So this step may seem obvious at first, but I think it's often skipped or maybe rushed through a little bit. And I think it's really important and valuable to take the time to really sit down and determine what learning objectives you want to be able to answer through this data collection. So you can start by broadly defining what you want to learn, and that might be kind of an overall question like, are clients satisfied with our services? And from there, I think it's good practice to come up with these clearly defined sub-questions. So an example could be, do clients feel our services are respectful and culturally appropriate? Do our clients feel our services are useful? Others could include, do clients feel services are accessible? So I think there's a whole range of sub-questions that could be, that you could talk with your program team to really define carefully. And we also, to inform what we want to learn, we may also want to consider what feedback we currently collect and what have we learned from it so far. So has this data been useful and have we been able to act on it? Or do we need to make some changes or adaptations? And we may also want to think about what feedback do clients themselves want to provide? What can we learn from that? And as we're delivering daily services, clients may also be sharing things with us about topics that are important to them. And so second, I think it's important to consider, why do we want to learn this? How will we use what we learn? So I think at this stage, you'll want to really evaluate your plans to act on what you learn from any feedback you receive, as well as any constraints that may prevent you from taking action. So if we're interested in learning whether clients are satisfied with our program, but there's contextual factors or donor requirements that mean that we don't have an ability to act on what we learn, we also in some ways risk generating some resentment among those we have taken the time who've shared their opinions and ideas for improvement. So I think it's important to consider that before we really implement all of this. Okay, so then now I'd like to get your thoughts. Could you tell us one question about your program that you are interested in answering by gathering client feedback? You might already have plans to gather this feedback, or it might just be a question that you're particularly interested in, but haven't taken any action on. So if you could maybe in the chat send us a message to all participants, and then we can take a look at what kind of questions are interesting to different organizations and people. So I'll give everyone a few minutes just to gather their thoughts on that.
So this is Meg again. Looks like some great responses are coming in. Austin mentioned that they are looking to gauge satisfaction with travel and reception at the transit station or airport. Yahweh said that they are interested in how can we best engage in conversation when the client doesn't identify themselves as a victim or survivor of human trafficking. Kate shared that she's interested in learning our services improving client situations. Oh, and coming in quick now, maybe several dozen others that I'm seeing as well. take a quick look here. Teresa shared that they're interested in learning what are the gaps in our services that we currently offer that are priorities for clients. And Summer shared, is there anything we can do to better explain the services we provide to avoid confusion about programs? These are all great comments. There are many more. I would encourage everyone to check out the chat and see what your colleagues are interested in learning. One thought of mine in reading through the responses is I think you can see the variation between a more general question that could serve as a starting point for defining specific questions for data analysis and other questions that are already quite specific and can hone in on more detailed information that you would want to learn. Thanks everyone for participating in this activity.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so there's a lot of great suggestions and questions. So to move on to discussing the rest of the questions, I think number 2 of our kind of those 6 questions that I laid out is what type of data do we need to answer this question? So in terms of qualitative versus quantitative, right? So qualitative information really measures what is being studied with words, observations, descriptions, and perceptions. And this is really useful to answer broad questions like why, how, under what circumstances. And it can help us to explore, clients' opinions, feelings, and priorities. And it can help also explain behaviors or beliefs, offering depth of understanding on a given topic. Whereas quantitative information measures what is being studied with numbers, counts, percentages, proportions. And it more often answers narrowly defined questions. So it can help explain, the nature, the size, the frequency, and the distribution of a problem. So deciding this will inform the methods you choose. Are you going to choose focus groups and interviews, which are really better suited to collect qualitative data, or survey data, which is often more quantified. And it also informs the type of questions and answer options you develop. So open-ended questions will result in more qualitative data, while closed questions can be more easily be quantified. And so another, I think, important distinction with these key questions you develop, can they be answered by gathering feedback data? So this is the data on perceptions, preferences, things like expectations and aspirations of clients, or are you looking more for factual data, which would be data on knowledge, practices, or outcomes of clients? And sometimes it might be the case that your questions are not necessarily best answered by feedback data. So for example, if you are interested in knowing whether an ESL program is effective, asking a client's opinion on this may yield different results than reviewing ESL post-test scores. But both types of information could be beneficial depending on the type of question you have. And you might want to sometimes use multiple methods, actually. So moving on to question number 3, who can provide this information? So you want to identify the different populations that you serve or that you intend to serve. And you can think about both direct and indirect clients. So your direct clients, for an employment program, they may include, the employment-aged men and women who attend your job readiness training classes, for example. While in this case, your indirect clients might include employment partners you work with who are intended to benefit from, these job placement and ongoing post-placement services from your agency. And then within this group of intended clients, maybe you want to consider also consulting clients who are eligible but who did not participate. you might want to look at male and female clients, clients of different age groups, to see potentially what are the barriers for them not attending classes. And consider whether you wish to consult non-clients, community members, partners, etc. And then consider the subgroups within these, direct and indirect client groups. So how can you break down your target populations further? And this will inform your selection of appropriate methods. And you'll also be able to disaggregate the data more effectively. So I think at a minimum, you'll want to be able to disaggregate by gender and age, but nationality, native language, education level. These all may be relevant subgroups that you might be interested in. So now let's move on to question 4, which is what data collection methods will enable us to collect this information? So after we know what information we need and where to collect it, next is really considering what data methods are best suited to collecting it. So some methods are more suitable for collecting quantitative information, as I mentioned, and some are more suited for qualitative information. And it may be helpful to ask yourself, what data collection methods do you currently use to collect feedback? As I mentioned, you can look at how effective these have been and what flexibility do you have to change them. And you should also consider which methods may be more or less preferred by your clients. So different groups may have different preferences. And I think in particular, ensuring that vulnerable groups or those who are potentially more marginalized in the community have access to feedback channels they feel comfortable with is important. So, if you're interested in feedback data about a case management program with a vulnerable group, individual in-depth interviews may be best suited, since that's more private and discreet. So take the time to really carefully consider the implications of these different cultural, linguistic, or gender dynamics that may all be relevant. And then also power dynamics. Typically people with more power or, kind of more dominant voices will more easily be able to find ways to share their feedback with you. But I think members of less powerful groups may not be able to express themselves, for example, in a very public forum. You'll also want to think about pre-literate people who will be prevented from completing self-administered, text-based surveys. And so Graham will later walk through some possible methods in more detail, including some pros and cons. But in an ideal scenario, you might want to think about using a combination of methods. So that's both in order to effectively answer your questions and learning priorities, and also to accommodate, as many client preferences as possible. And so moving on to question 5, these are, kind of our realistic constraints, right? What human and financial resources do we need to collect this data, and do we have them? So some data collection methods will require more financial and human resources than others. And often there's a trade-off between rigor and financial cost. So I think this is, not a one-size-fits-all. It's really important to consider what resources will be required to collect, manage, analyze, and also disseminate your data using the method you've chosen, and then really think about what your existing capacities are. So there's a lot of kind of questions you might want to consider, and I'll just throw out a few as examples. So, would you need to design new tools and instruments? Would tools need to be translated? How many staff and how much time are needed for data collection? What kind of training would staff need? What resources would you need for transportation or coordination activities? And if you're planning to collect data using mobile data collection methods, what kind of equipment, data plans, or software would be required. So really thinking about, for each method, what are all these steps? What is the time commitment? What is the financial commitment? And then if you do have very kind of strong budget limitations, maybe reassess what data you plan to collect and the data collection methods you will use. So sometimes, even if you you have a kind of a beautiful plan and it's just not realistic, we might need to kind of scale back our strategy. And then finally, 6, what actions or decisions could we take as a result of this client feedback data? So as I mentioned before engaging in data collection, we should try to make sure that we have the ability to effectively use the results of client feedback in our programs, because this really helps demonstrate that we respect clients' time and it helps maintain their trust. And then when clients do provide feedback, we should aim to explain how their feedback was taken into account and what changes we were able to make, and also which changes we are not able to implement, right? Because we won't be able to implement everything. And then the reasons behind these decisions. And then plan to close the loop by communicating results with clients. So this really depends on your context, but it could be done through something like a workshop or community meeting, or something more informal. For sensitive topics, you may want to speak to people individually. So it kind of depends on the situation. So after going through those 6 key questions to keep in mind, I wanted to pause for a moment before we continue to just see if there's questions.
Great, thank you, Fleur. Any questions can be typed into the chat. I saw some folks also typing into the Q&A as well. So feel free to add those. I don't believe I've seen any yet, although 1 or 2 may have gotten mixed in with our questions that you're looking to learn from your clients. So if you did miss your question, you already submitted it, go ahead and type it in again. For now, Flora, unless any questions happen to come in, why don't we go ahead and move on? We'll have more time for questions towards the end.
Okay, great. So I'd like to move on now to feedback channels and methods. So let's talk about a few types of feedback channels now. All right. First, we can think about proactive channels. Those are channels we use to actively solicit feedback from clients. So this is really where we as the organization, the program staff have specific questions in mind, and we're actively developing feedback methods. So an example would be drafting a survey. Next, we have reactive, which are safe channels through which clients can reach us when they wish. So this is also, a mechanism or feedback set up by our organization, but it isn't tied to staff asking questions at a particular time frame. It's really, clients reach out when they have something to contribute or some type of feedback. And then finally, open. So these are channels to collect the spontaneous feedback that clients share in the course of daily interactions. And that could be, in a variety of ways. So talking through these 3 types of feedback channels, just wanted to get some examples and see what you think. Do you think these are proactive, reactive, or open? So our first example is comments to front desk staff that the client may just come up and provide some feedback. What do you think? Is this a proactive, reactive, or open channel? If you want to just type your response in the chat. Okay, just scrolling through. Looks like most of you are saying open, which I think I also agree with. And The focus group discussion is another type of feedback channel. So what do you think? Is this a proactive, reactive, or open channel? All right. Looks like everyone is saying proactive. Yeah, that's right. So this is really something, that we as staff actively plan to solicit, and it takes place at a a specific time frame, and we're really already thinking through the questions that we're going to ask. And then finally, a comment or complaint hotline. So this same proactive, reactive, or open if you want to share in the chat. Okay. Yep, I'm seeing a lot of reactive. So that's great. So just wanted to point out a few considerations for reactive feedback channels. So one is to develop internal systems to manage the feedback and complaints. And another one is to ensure confidentiality of feedback and any complaints received. We also want to ensure that there's specific protocols are in place to manage sensitive complaints and information. And finally, we want to plan for what to do when feedback falls outside of the organization's mandate. So in some cases, it might be possible to refer some of these requests to partners or other stakeholders. And planning for that in advance helps to streamline the process. So now we'd like to poll you again. So I'll pass it on to Meg for this poll.
Thanks so much, Fleur. So I just went ahead and opened up that poll. I think that should be working all right now. So if you have seen a poll, go ahead and pop up on your screen. Please answer that. For those who have collected client feedback data before, what is the most common proactive method that you've used? We've listed some of the most common here: surveys, individual in-depth interviews, or focus group discussions. If you've used something else or you've used all of these equally in some combination, tell us more in the chat. Great. See, many of you are answering that. I'll leave it open for about 10 more seconds to get a bit more input. Okay, I'm closing that poll out now. There'll be about 15 seconds as anyone typing finishes their response, and I'll share the feedback with everyone. Thanks so much for participating in this poll. So you should be able to see that it looks like surveys were the most common among the participants who responded. 32 respondents said that that's the one that you've used the most. 11 of you said that you've used individual in-depth interviews most frequently, and 5 said that you've used focus group discussions most frequently. So it sounds like there is a bit of a mix as well. Feel free to add more context into the chat as we move into our next session, next section of this session, which will dive into a lot more detail on these different methods. Hi, Greg. I think you may be muted.
Hi, Meg. Can you hear me?
I can. Perfect.
Thank you. Hi, everybody, and thanks to Switchboard for the opportunity to join in this presentation and this discussion. As mentioned at the beginning, I work with the IRC as a technical advisor for research, and a large part of my role focuses on the problem of coming up with the right kinds of questions so that we can generate the right kind of data that can really inform improvements to our practice. And I think, as probably everybody on the call is fully aware of, there's no easy recipe for this. And I think, as Flora's presentation really alluded to, it's not like there are steps that we can take to bake the perfect cake. We work in a socially complex environment, and so I think there's value in constantly revisiting these kinds of questions that we're raising in this session around the conditions of knowledge production. So, building on what Flora has said, I'll briefly go through three of the arguably major methods that we use to collect feedback data, and reflect on these in light of a current IRC initiative to strengthen our client feedback. So this is a process that we're in the midst of, and there's lots of experimentation and trial and error. So it's very much an ongoing project. So firstly, what can we say about the advantages of surveys? Actually, sorry, let's just briefly define a survey. It's really just a method for systematically collecting information from a defined population. And many surveys are either self-administered, so people who are responding to the surveys complete the questionnaire themselves, or they may be enumerated. You might use a slightly different terminology around this, but that's essentially a survey that's administered by an interviewer, a person who's administering the survey, and someone who's trained to record the responses. So some of the advantages of conducting surveys is that they produce data that's relatively easy to quantify and organize. So there is a lot of software out there that we can use to collect survey responses, and it quite seamlessly nowadays can give us the data in a form that can be fed into various kinds of data analysis software programs, and it can be generated in quite clean ways and analyzed quite easily. So it's a method that really lends itself to quantifiable or a quantitative approach to data collection. If we tend to draw samples from the populations that we're interested in, and if the sample is large enough, and if it's generated in a randomized way, we can generate data that's representative of a much larger population. It's also a good tool for capturing well-defined information, so for measuring certain effects that we're quite certain of. And it raises the question of validity. So without being too technical, validity really refers to the extent to which our data captures or measures reality. So if we were measuring or seeking to measure depression, for example, it's really important that our measures actually measure depression and not something else. Surveys are also useful for collecting other kinds of data for which the question of validity is not so critical. So if we were just interested, for example, if a population was happy about something, we could ask them if they were happy and record that response without getting too bogged down into questions of validity. So really just take it more at face value. Surveys are also good for collecting what we call panel data. So these are surveys that are essentially repeated over time. So we ask the same question at one point in time as we do it at a later point in time, and then measure the differences in responses. And that's a good way of measuring change over time. Of course, there are some disadvantages and limitations to using surveys. Surveys are actually quite easy to do, but they're really difficult to do well. So we can be deceived by surveys sometimes, and the degree of skill and efforts required to do a really good, rigorous survey that can contribute meaningfully to our understanding. They can also be quite blunt instruments, as I think Flora pointed out earlier, and quite insensitive because we're in our efforts to try and standardize the way that we ask questions and record responses, we may be, it may reflect a certain kind of insensitivity that other methods don't. And this is especially if the data we're collecting is at a more exploratory phase of understanding. So we're really, we're really kind of reaching out and not really knowing what the data means. So if we look at, morbidity and mortality surveys, these collect really important information, but they're not, about why, what people die from and when they die. But what they're not good at telling us, for example, is why an individual may have died from a preventable disease within the particular social context that they're living in. Surveys can also be costly and time-consuming, particularly if we seek to implement large surveys, large representative surveys. They inevitably take longer than we assume. And then moving on to the question of individual in-depth interviews. This method essentially involves one-on-one conversations with individuals who have a knowledge about a topic of interest. So sometimes the difference between a survey and a survey encounter and an individual encounter is not that clear, but generally we use interviews to describe the types of encounters that are less structured than a survey type of encounter. So, so typically interviews might be more open-ended. They don't have to be totally open-ended. They could be semi-structured. In other words, the interviewer would go in with a list of topics that they might want to discuss, but no specific questions that require specific answers. And there is also an open-endedness to this, which the idea is that it allows the respondent to not just answer questions, but to really shape the discussion in a way that can bring in new questions and perhaps provide some commentary on the appropriateness of the questions that are being asked. So that's the kind of ideal that we work towards here. Some of the advantages of in-depth interviews: they're good for collecting data around people's perceptions and experiences and feelings. They're not bound by the kind of protocol of a survey. So if an interesting piece of information emerges, the interviewer can pursue that, even though they may not have anticipated that. Topics can be explored in depth. So an interviewer can throw out a question which is not simply answered, but can lead to a kind of in-depth discussion about the relevance of that particular question to the respondent. And interviews are also more amenable to topics that sensitive topics that require a kind of one-on-one interaction. Now, one could also argue that a survey that's enumerated anonymously can also generate useful data around sensitive topics, and I think that's a consideration that we have to constantly keep in mind. Some of the disadvantages of interviews is that interviewers must be careful around the question of bias. There are different schools of thought around the question of bias, and some people argue that some kind of interviewer bias is inevitable and is always brought to an interview context, and that the best thing that we can do about that is to be aware of the bias that we bring. It also means that interviews don't always generate the same kind of information. So, an otherwise identical interviewer conducted by two interviewers, each with different background characteristics. For example, let's say one was male, one was female, might produce a very different kind of response, and both of those responses may be truthful and may be accurate, and neither would be right or wrong. They would just be responses that reflect the particular kind of interaction with the interviewer. In general, the interviews, because they require they require researchers with more skill. They tend to take longer. They tend to, or in some instances, they build on relationships. They're typically limited to a smaller sample. So, and because they also tend to be non-standardized, they don't speak to the question of representativity. So the kinds of responses you collect through interviews cannot make strong claims of being representative of larger populations. And then the findings, this is a real one we encounter a lot at the IRC, is that they generate very rich findings, but they're very difficult to manage as data. Long narratives have to be transcribed, and they have to be analyzed. We can use software for that, but it doesn't necessarily reduce the workload as much as what we would like. And they have to be analyzed repeatedly in light of new information. It also requires an active interpretation, which again then speaks back to the question of bias. And then finally, focus group discussions. This is, I think, as everyone is aware, a method involving structured discussion with small groups of 6 to 12 people, using both standardized and follow-up questions to collect information about people's experiences, feelings, and preferences. Some of the pros of focus groups is that they're good for getting kind of gut responses from people, so good for getting feedback on a particular service or product. Another thing that's often forgotten, I think particularly in our sector about focus groups, is it's not just a dialogue between an interviewer and a respondent, but really good focus groups that are well facilitated are generate data through a discussion between the participants themselves. So I think for everyone who's facilitated a focus group, the real kind of feeling of satisfaction is when you get to a point where the group is engaging with one another and you're learning or generating data through these kind of intergroup or intragroup interactions between the individuals that comprise a group. So it's also a flexible format that allows for the exploration of unexpected topics. A participant, in that context might be empowered to bring a new piece of information which the researcher hadn't anticipated, and if it resonates with the group, that can be developed further and become a real kind of central concern for the researcher. Then the disadvantages is that these types of, this method for data collection really does require a good facilitator, and I say this as someone who doesn't regard themselves as a particularly good focus group facilitator, but I have worked with people who are really superb, and I think in some senses this is a skill that isn't necessarily learned. It's a talent that some people are just good at doing this, and some are not. Focus groups are also vulnerable to being overpowered by dominant voices, which Flora mentioned earlier, that somebody who is particularly assertive can either lead the group in a certain direction or simply dominate the discussion and suppress other voices. So that's something that has to be managed in the facilitation process, and sometimes it's not always possible to manage it as easily and effectively as we like. The group dynamics may also be unsuited to sensitive topics. People don't want to, in a semi-public forum, disclose issues, things that are maybe they may regard as quite sensitive. And then I think the same as interviews, it can generate lots and lots of narrative-based data that is really difficult to make sense of unless you have a really good analysis plan. So just to hang this onto something real, I'll just mention very briefly, and initiative that IRC is involved in regarding the accountability to affected parties framework, which we are developing. This is something that I think many people on the call might be familiar with. In 2018, the U.S. State Department's Bureau for Population, Refugees, and Migration introduced this Accountability to Affected Populations framework, or the AAP, as a requirement for all resettlement agencies in the United States. This framework was developed originally by the United Nations Interagency Standing Committee, the IASC, in 2011, and it's intended as a client-centered and rights-based approach to service delivery. In essence, it ensures that clients receive information, are able to participate meaningfully in decisions related to services that they receive, and are able to provide feedback that informs improved service delivery. So this is really what it's involved in, but I'm particularly concerned with the feedback and complaints part of it, so generating data that provides meaningful feedback within this broader framework. And that's something that we're currently piloting across our network and trying to come up with the best method or methods. I think it's fairly open at this point for generating the kind of feedback data that can inform improved programming and improved practice on our side. So we're looking at questions like identifying the right feedback questions, ensuring that these enable client participation, collecting data that's useful in the sense that it's not that we can actually act on it, that it's data that can inform change, and that can measure our progress over time, that it's collected in a form that can show us if we're making progress over time, and collecting data that can incorporate that can be incorporated back fairly directly, if possible, into our practice. So these are the 4 methods that we're currently piloting, and I'm afraid we're very much in the process of collecting data, so I don't have too much to share on this. But after a long process of staff engagement around possible feedback methods for collecting data, we landed on 4 options that we're currently exploring. The first is a series of focus groups that are facilitated by either headquarters staff or executive director staff. And the idea behind this was initially to really expose EDs to clients in a feedback kind of context. And what we're looking at is the effect of having either an ED or a headquarters staff member facilitating the focus groups, what kinds of skills are required to facilitate good focus groups, and the process of generating and analyzing and incorporating data. Then secondly, we have a headquarters-led phone survey where clients are contacted by enumerators in their home language, and a survey is enumerated in their home language by somebody who they don't know, but who is from within the IRC ecosystem. So it's not as anonymous as some phone-based surveys, but it's not a survey that's being conducted with someone with whom they've had any kind of personal interaction with. So we're looking at the effect of that. And then we're also trying to put out an online survey where basically the same survey form is being sent out to clients really through a text, a link in a text message from a trusted IRC source, and that would enable them to self-enumerate the survey in their home language. And obviously the concern that we have here is that clients who are pre-literate might be excluded, their voice might be excluded from this, and we want to try and get a sense of that effect. And we also really don't have a sense of who is is responding to this. There's, as with all online surveys, there's very limited control that one has over the context of collecting data. And then at the same time, we're also piloting a 90-day closeout interview, and we are trying to attach a very abridged version of our survey form to this, with a view to seeing if we can collect some feedback data within the 90-day closeout interview context. And of course, we're looking at this. We're looking at questions of whether we can collect meaningful data in such an abridged way, and whether there's any effect of collecting it through an interview that's essentially enumerated by a caseworker. So lots of questions around this that are enabling us to really explore the question of client participation, client voice, the question of validity of the data. I think by comparing the data and the kinds of findings that we're generating from these different methods and the differences between them, it's enabling us to look at the question of validity and the practicalities of collecting, managing, and analyzing data and producing results that measure performance. So I guess I'll hand back to Meg for the next section.
Great. Thank you so much, Graham. Because we have just a few moments left for Q&A, please, everyone, do submit your questions in the chat, and we'll jump right into answering a few of them at the same time as we put up on the screen a image of some future or additional resources that you may be interested in. So, Flor, would you like to take the first question that we received, which is, can a focus group discussion be considered reactive? If you hold a focus group discussion to get more details on a major complaint that's repeated by many clients, would you consider it reactive to keep the issue from getting worse?
So can you hear me all right, first of all?
I can.
Great. So I think in that case, the focus group discussion would still be considered a proactive channel. Since you're really, setting it up and you're informed by the feedback you've received through, either open or reactive channels. That said, I think it's a great idea to use the focus group to do a deeper dive into, some of the questions some of the feedback you're receiving through other channels.
Great, thank you, Flor. Maybe a question next for Graham. Can you talk about when we may need to get IRB approval for collecting internal data if we also use it for reasons like grant proposals or conference presentations?
Oh, well, thanks very much. That's a great question, and I think there are many considerations in this. But in general, we don't need to get IRB approval for collecting data for internal purposes, and generally, as a rule of thumb, I also believe that if we are not publishing the data, and by publishing, it could be really disseminating it beyond our own organization for the purposes of the data being consumed, then I think we don't need. At least we've read it that way, that we don't need IRB approval. For conference presentations, I would think that's sort of approaching the line of research, and I think that would. But for grant proposal presentations, I would think that we're not publishing the data and or presenting it in any kind of way. So I think it really depends on the situation, and it's always a topic of discussion, and I think a good question.
Great, thank you, Graham. For those who are heading out right at the end of the hour, I wanted to give everyone a heads up that you'll be prompted to complete our feedback survey when closing this webinar, and to say thank you for joining. I would really appreciate if you complete the feedback survey to help us improve in the future. For others who can stick around for another minute or two, we'll continue taking questions. We received a good question on qualitative data, which is, do you have recommendations on software that can assist us in managing and analyzing qualitative data? Graham, do you want to take that one as well?
Sure. I don't have a ton of experience, with all of the products that are out there. I've tried most of them, mostly the kinds of free versions that get put out. One of the concerns I have with the qualitative data software is that a lot of it is really expensive, and it doesn't really do anything that you can't do manually or using other tools. So I think if you're looking at qualitative data analysis software, really look at what it can do, and if you really need the things that it offers as the qualities that it offers. I think a lot of them are things that we don't generally use, and a lot of the basics of qualitative data analysis, such as coding, we can do with things like Microsoft Word and other text-based software that's searchable. I've used NVivo the most, but I've also used MaxQDA, which is pretty good, and then Atlas TI is another one.
Great, thank you. Well, I guess why don't we wrap up there, just because we're already at a minute past. But I want to say again a huge thank you to attendees for joining us on this topic today, and of course to Fleur and to Graham for presenting. Like I mentioned, you will receive that feedback survey as soon as you close out this webinar. And we'd also love if you stay in touch with Switchboard. Check out some of the resources that we mentioned on this slide, including a guide that goes into a lot more detail on some of the topics that we covered today. You can find us online at www.switchboardta.org, and always reach out to us at switchboard@rescue.org. Thank you again, everyone.